Okay, Billie, this is the third part of the phonology exam, the conversation. We'll have a 50-minute conversation about different aspects of phonology. Okay, let's begin by talking about consonant sounds, because we talked quite a bit about vowel sounds in your presentation. The Underhill chart is organised according to a certain rationale. What do you understand that rationale to be for the consonant part of it? How has he placed them?
So there are 3 rows of consonant sounds in the chart, and the first one is, it contains all the plosives, and there are 2 affricates in the middle, but all the rest are plosives, and they go kind of in pairs, as in unvoiced and then the voiced p and b, for example. They go in pairs through the row, and then there is also a logic behind the order in each row, because you basically start with the sounds that you form at the front of the mouth, like with both your lips, and then it kind of wanders through the mouth to the back. And the second row are the fricatives, so f and v, for example, and again they go in pairs, unvoiced, voiced, from the front to the back, not quite as far back as the plosives, but almost. And then in the last row, it's slightly different, the organization. There are no pairs, because all of the sounds are voiced, apart from one, which is h in the middle, and the first 3 are nasal sounds, and then you have, I think it's h after that, and then l, the lateral, the only lateral we have, and then the last 3, I always think of them as the special 3 little sounds, because y, w, and r are also used a lot in connected speech to link between word boundaries.
Right, okay. So we can talk about, you've mentioned there sort of place and manner of articulation. Can you give an example? For example, say you've got the sound b and v, as you mentioned, b is voiced, they're both voiced. And what are the place and manner of articulation of those?
So b, the manner is it's a voiced sound, and the place of articulation is bilabial, because you use both your lips. And, well, the same would be true as in the place of articulation for p, only that it's unvoiced.
Right, okay.
So the movement of the articulators is the same, but you don't use your vocal cords.
Right. B and v actually is a kind of minimal pair that is often cited as a problem for Spanish students. Do you find that, or are there other sounds that you think are more problematic for them?
That is a problem, definitely. They mix up b and v, or say something that's sort of halfway in the middle, and it causes a problem if the word like berry or berry, we have a distinction here. It's a minimal pair, but then there are other sounds as well. In terms of consonants, the sound j is sometimes quite difficult. Also, I think, obviously the h is sometimes a little bit overpronounced or missing. It depends, again, on the spelling of the word. And I have found a lot of my students struggle if it's a longer word and you have a couple of sounds appearing quite close to each other, like sh and s, and then, like for example, in discussion or sushi, although that's short, and then they get a little bit muddled up as to which one to say.
And do you find the chart helps you, helps students to produce these sounds or understand them better? Because some teachers say it's a bit confusing, to have.
Yes, I mean, as I said, it really depends on your class, and if you have, from the very beginning, consistently use certain symbols of sounds that are new or problematic or more difficult, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
At this time, I don't introduce all of the chart to my students, because my classes are usually relatively short, so it would, I think I would put a lot of effort into something that I then can't use for such a long time. But yeah, I think for sounds like j or ch, it makes sense to use them consistently and to point them out. It can help students. I don't think that the student necessarily needs to know now about the organization of the chart in order to improve their pronunciation. I don't think that is necessary. However, for example, the difference between n and and when n is followed by a g or by a k in spelling, that is good. But again, I don't know how useful the symbol is on its own. You need to make sure that the student actually understands how you form the sound and how your articulators move, and you have to explain and make it a physical experience again so that they can actually produce it. And then,
Yeah, I'm thinking about teaching. I mean, activities, ship or sheep, tree or three were very commonly used traditionally, headway pronunciation, and now we've got pronunciation games as well, and other materials. Do you use any of these materials with your students, and if so, which ones?
Yes, every now and again I use mainly games from pronunciation games from Mark's book. I really like his games. I think they're all quite nice, and there's this game aspect which students enjoy, and you can either focus on sounds if that's the problem, or word stress or intonation. I personally think that there isn't placed enough emphasis on intonation, because that is what makes the difference really. And if your intonation or the student's intonation improves and the sentence stress, then usually they'll be understood better and also perceived as a better language learner, I think.
Okay.
So
that's interesting. So you'd focus more with the learners on intonation than individual sounds?
I think I should.
But you don't. Well, let's talk a little bit more about... Well, let's go back and talk about the theory of intonation a bit more, and then we'll come back to what we can do in the classroom. People talk about three areas that intonation affects in language. What are they?
So intonation can affect grammar or discourse. Do you want me to give an example straight away for each? Okay, so for grammar, for example, if you would compare two sentences with like a positive affirmative sentence and a negative one, that you would stress the negative to make clear that this is now like I can swim or I can't swim. So that, but that is more the sentence stress.
No, that's sentence stress already. Going back to intonation, you're right. About the grammar.
The grammar, obviously you can indicate if you're asking a question.
Okay, for example.
In English, you would usually have a rising intonation only with yes/no questions and a falling intonation.
Yeah.
With discourse, it's more to signal if you have finished speaking.
Right. Maybe
if you're giving your opinion or you're listing different items, and you signal with a falling intonation that you have finished. And the problem here sometimes is that and Spanish tends to use a rising intonation a lot more. So that might leave the listener slightly confused as to either are you actually asking me a question or have you finished speaking, or where are we in the conversation?
Right.
So that can cause a bit of problems, and attitude can be affected as well through intonation. If the pattern is very different to what we would perceive as normal, then you might come across as slightly bored, not necessarily with the Spanish speakers, I think, but thinking back of the time when I taught in the UK and I had more of an international classroom, I definitely had a couple of students, maybe more from students with Russian as a first language, or Asian students maybe, where the intonation is a little bit flat. And then, of course, they would sound slightly bored. And you might want to liven up this.
Can this be taught then, do you think? Because you mentioned before you'd like to do more, implying that maybe you have. And what do you think you and maybe other teachers could do more to help students with intonation, or is it just something they have to pick up?
No, I think that you should make a point out of improving it in the classroom, especially if you notice that students have not become aware of it and adapted their own speech, and they have not kind of adapted to a more English intonation.
How would you do that?
Yes, that is the good question. It's very difficult. But I think you could practice maybe using a dialogue, maybe even a dialogue like a transcript that you wrote up from a little video where the intonation is very clear and maybe even a bit exaggerated, so that you could use this as a model, and you could annotate a rise or a fall in the transcript with the students and then practice it, giving everybody a different role. And I think it pays off if you exaggerate a little bit when you practice, because then usually if you just talk normally, then you get it right. I mean, the question is, how much can you change some of these intonation? I think some people are more adaptive. They are very good listeners and they pick up on a different intonation pattern and they can adapt their own speech, because some people are also more musical. Other people achieve a high language level in terms of grammar and vocabulary, but are totally deaf towards intonation. It might be more hard work with them.
Okay. Right, well, let's move on now to another area, which is connected speech. A few questions about that. What do you understand by assimilation?
Okay, assimilation occurs when a word, a sound really assimilates, becomes more similar to the following sound, usually between word boundaries. So, for example, I live in Barcelona. If I say those words in isolation, in would end in an n sound. But of course, in connected speech, if I speak fast in normal average speed, I would say in Barcelona, and the n assimilates, becomes an n because of the b that is following.
Okay, and what about elision? What's that?
Elision is when a sound is deleted. Again, that happens usually at the end of a word, when at the boundary between two words. And quite often it's a t that is affected. Not only, but it usually is. So next week, of course, if I say it, overpronounce it, very British, or if I say the words in isolation, you hear a t, but in a sentence, I come and see you next week. Next week, there's no t anymore. And often also in can't, the t is lost, which is why it's important to teach the stress in a negative sentence, because you can't really hear the t anymore.
Okay. Thinking back in general over the course, the diploma course, what in terms of the phonology that you've learned, what's been the most useful or had the most impact on your teaching, do you think? What areas?
Well, I focused on sentence stress and intonation in my developmental record in one of my projects, and I did quite a lot of different activities with the students, and that was really useful because, as I said, I think it's a little bit neglected in course books, and so and also, you might just not know as much as a teacher's only done an initial training course. So it's something that you kind of shy away and you don't really address. So I made a particular point out of doing several activities and trying to integrate it more into my lessons. And that was very useful